We're starting a little late, but thank you all for getting back. Well, I want to make a quick announcement. We actually have an item, we have an item 5 and 6, but we have an item number 4, which is a opportunity for public comment on the allocation of funds generated from the petroleum storage fee. We may not get to that until pretty late this afternoon because that's a give us feedback issue. If you'd like to speak with Lisa Babcock, Lisa, will you raise your hand? She'll take in all your comments and then report to us at the end of the day. If you want to be able to leave, you're obviously welcome to stay if you'd like to stay till the end, but it's going to be a long day. Okay. Any other announcements I need to make? Okay, good. It's still raining and I'm still happy about it. That's how I'll open the afternoon. Now we'll go to the next group, Group C, Arcadia, Claremont, and Sierra Madre. That's 15 minutes.
Well, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon.
Chair, members of the board. My name is Andre Monette. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Best & Krieger. And I'm appearing today on behalf of Arcadia and Claremont. I read it, so I remembered. And I'm also happy about the rain. I'm going to be pretty general in our comments today. First of all, I don't want to rehash stuff that other people have said, but we're going to use the written comment deadline in January to get more specific. We got to make sure I have the right things. So I'm just going to, talk big picture and policy for both the cities that we have here and the statewide implications of this draft order. And I think that everyone agrees that the real meat and potatoes of this draft order is the decision to require strict compliance with receiving water limitations in the LA County stormwater permit. And I think everyone pretty much agrees that the state board has the discretion under state and federal law to make that decision. And to the extent that the Ninth Circuit has already ruled on that issue, and it's pretty clear. If the state or EPA decides to include a direct tie to water quality standards or numeric effluent limits in a municipal stormwater permit, it can do that. The only note of caution we would have is that if those standards and those requirements aren't attainable, we would view that as an abuse of discretion. But what really matters for this order is that the state board has made a decision to require receiving water limitations and a tie to those in this permit. And what's critical for my cities is to have a compliance option and a pathway to attaining those standards. And why is that? It's because immediate compliance with receiving water limitations just simply isn't feasible. And we've heard a lot of testimony on it already. I think if everyone is realistic about the issue, you can look at the picture. The Los Angeles River watershed, San Gabriel River watershed, they're far from pristine. And if we're going to attain a fishable, swimmable goal throughout those watersheds, it's going to take time and resources, and more than just a permit term. And it's going to take significant investments, and we're working on that. And this draft order allows that. And so the message that we want to give to the state board, more than anything, is that we need a compliance approach, and that without it, there's no option. We're out of compliance, and we're subject to litigation. And I wanted to pause on that point for a minute because our friends at NRDC are great, and they've aptly noted there have been 2 lawsuits filed on stormwater permits in California, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, we haven't traditionally had strict numerical requirements in stormwater permits, right? So there's not an easy target. We have those in the POTW setting, in the sewage treatment setting, and guess what? There's a cottage industry of attorneys, not NRDC, but just attorneys out there that run around and file lawsuits all day long. And by removing the compliance option from this permit, you create that kind of setting for the stormwater arena. And we could have a debate about what the appropriate enforcement role is for attorneys or groups like that. But I think the fundamental question is, do you want to create that, and what is the best use of public funds? And in our view, obviously, I represent cities. Our view is we need the compliance option because we'd like to spend those public funds on, oops, wrong way.
Isn't the argument, for the sake of argument again, to help tee up the issues, isn't part of it, I get the argument about the cottage industry. I mean, I will say I tend to be a fan of the citizen supervision of the Clean Water Act because it's done an awful lot of good that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Just to be clear that nonetheless there are lawsuits you wish people hadn't filed all over the place, but there are others that have changed the course of history in a good way that even makes the defendants happy, speaking as a former defendant as well as a plaintiff in those. But isn't part of what, and I'll perhaps let the NRDC and other folks speak for themselves, but isn't part of their argument not that you should leave the doorway open, but that using CDOs and other compliance tools with actual some set numbers is a better way to go? They're not saying leave the door open, they're saying deal with it through a compliance order rather than the iterative process, as I'm oversimplifying.
Well, yeah, but it also creates additional hooks for outside parties to come in that aren't, I mean, because again, NRDC's got, and Heal the Bay, and you know, the coastkeeper groups, they are generally our partners when they can be. And I don't think they're going around doing that. But if you leave the door open for other people, even with the CDOs and the time schedule orders and things like that, because those are enforceable orders as well. And beyond that, a lot of those have set time limits. And so if we're looking at meeting receiving water limitations beyond a single permit term, which I think this order, you know, evinces an intent to do. We get to come back under this order if we have to. If we take that other approach, that largely is probably going to go away, because there are limitations on how many times you can renew a TSO. There are limitations on that kind of an approach that I think, you know, would be taken away if we took that approach versus what's allowed for in this order. And I think it's important because, you know, stormwater, we all know, is a diffuse source. We don't have the same kind of control over it that you do in a POTW setting or an industrial setting where you have a finite boundary to what you've got. And here, you know, we know that. You guys, the sophistication of the dialogue we've had already, we all know that. So I won't dwell on it. But again, the message that we need to send is that we need the compliance approach. We fully support a compliance approach. There are some things that we would like to see changed, and we're going to submit that in writing. But for the most part, the message we need to send to you is that we like that approach and we don't want it to go away. One last point is that, before I turn it over to my colleague, is that there's a lot of talk about the compliance option being a safe harbor. And you know what, to a certain extent it is. We don't like that term because it implies that we're not doing anything. But under the EWMP process and the WMP process, we're doing a lot. And this is the example that's here is the East San Gabriel Watershed Group Watershed Management Plan. It's got 4 participants. They've gone through the RAA process. Preliminary estimates is they're going to have to spend 20 times more than what their annual budget for stormwater is at this point. So these are significant investments. We're not just sitting on our hands doing nothing. We're being realistic and trying to build on what we can. And then, okay, so I lied. One last, I was not true. I've got one last point. The city of, we also represent the city of Santa Maria, and they asked me to make a comment today as well. So I know you folks are familiar with Santa Maria. They are working on an integrated plan. And they're one of 5 cities across the country that were awarded a grant from US EPA to develop an integrated plan. And they asked me to make a similar comment, that their integrated planning approach is completely contingent on being able to have a compliance option in their stormwater permit as well. And to encourage those kinds of behaviors, I think that this order and that option in this order should stand. So with that being said, thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Ms. Watley.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So just looking at this slide, so this plan, East San Gabriel Watershed Group, 20 times more annual stormwater spending. Could you put that into context on projects versus compliance, monitoring? And then if you could comment on NRDC's proposal regarding the BMP compliance models. I'm just trying to get a better idea of what the cost would be, you know, if those additional provisions were included, and what would it take away on a program like this?
Well,
or could it complement it?
I think it would take away because of that time schedule approach. I think this is the plan, the watershed management plan for the East San Gabriel watershed involves both structural regional BMPs as well as requiring low impact development through the regular redevelopment and development process, as well as monitoring. It's a blend of all 3. They can't do a watershed wide 85th percentile regional approach, but they can do it in smaller amounts. And I can't get much more specific than that, unfortunately. I didn't draft the plan. I'm not that familiar with it. But I do know that they need to be able to come back and say we need more time at times because of funding, but because also sometimes you do things and they don't work as well as you thought they would, and you need to be able to maintain compliance during that. And I think we can give the example of infiltration in various watersheds. I work in Orange County. We work on a selenium problem there. What we don't want to do is infiltrate water in certain places because you're going to put selenium back into the watershed. And so maybe you're infiltrating in one area, it's doing a great job at treating bacteria, but then you're putting some other pollutant back into a watershed and you're still not attaining the water quality standard. It's an extremely complex issue. And that's why we need a safe harbor, for lack of a better term. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Holly Watley, and I represent the petitioner City of Sierra Madre. And I just have really two slides I'm going to go over, but I'm focusing primarily on one issue or one theme that you've heard a few times, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. But I think it is so important that perhaps even hearing it a third time is worth it. And that is, picking up where Mr. Monette just left off, in speaking about the notion that the safe harbor provisions that we're talking about are not a free pass. They actually require an incredible commitment of time, staff time, consultant time. They require an incredible commitment of money, both from large cities and quite small cities like the city of Sierra Madre. So just by way of example here, this map here shows the Rio Hondo San Gabriel River Water Quality Group, and they submitted and are participating in an EWIMP. Although the slide there says Upper San Gabriel Water Quality Group, it's really the map has the correct name there. Mm-hmm. It's got 8 participants, and it's addressing watersheds in the LA River and San Gabriel River, and it does involve, this EWIMP obviously involves one of the infiltration BMPs to capture the 85th percentile event. So this EWIMP is not just trying to comply. This EWIMP has been prepared at the cost of about $1.7 million up there for doing that. That includes consultant costs, direct staff costs. It includes the costs for the environmental review, which for this portion alone were $300,000. Committed by the cities just to come up with a plan to figure out what needs to be done even later. So it is a long-range issue requiring quite a commitment of time and money. It is more than just trying. So it's really not a free pass. It's actually quite a costly path forward. But I think many recognize and see the value if your jurisdiction is situated geographically in an area that lends itself to the regional approach. Most cities see the value as good stewards of the environment, as folks that want to be stewards for water supply, including capturing that resource and seeing what we can do with it. It simply isn't the free pass. I think the testimony that we heard today from the LA board itself that 7 of the submitted WMPs were deemed deficient. So I do think, I want to echo that one point that somebody did make later, that calling this a free pass or as a get out of jail free card, it does an absolute disservice to the regional board and their implementation efforts and their enforcement efforts. With that in mind, there is one change that we would urge the board to seriously consider, and that is on the original permit on the EWIMP plan, cities that adopted the plan that captured the 85th percentile storm events were deemed in compliance. And the draft order changes that. It keeps that, but then also says, now you must include some monitoring, and if certain water quality standards are not met, you're at risk for additional projects or actions that may be required. I want to echo something that the mayor from Monrovia mentioned, which is at the time the cities had to choose which path to pursue, the EWIMP path, while requiring a significantly larger commitment, and especially in terms of time because of the regional coordination that it takes. At that time they made that choice, there was a bit of certainty that if they pursued that, if they met the deadlines, if they obtained approval and feedback from the board, which we know is not automatic and which we know will be strict. If they had done that and then implemented it, that they would be deemed in compliance at the time they chose that path. And now that finish line has been moved. And it has been moved not to a known place, but to an unknown place. You could invest all of this and still, at the end of the day, be out of compliance. And you could invest all of this and still, at the end of the day, be required to do more. We don't know how much more. We can't tell you now, and we can't tell you how much that will cost. And that uncertainty and that additional measure actually works as a disincentive for folks to pursue this regional approach. And in your draft order, you've got language in there at several places that talks about finding, or defining a finite path, a definite path, a well-defined finite alternative path that rewards those that pursue significant undertakings beyond the iterative process. And we would submit that adding this extra unknown issue actually takes away that reward, takes away that incentive. As counsel for the NRDC said, all the good stuff is in the EWIMP. All the good stuff is in the EWIMP. I actually think there's good stuff in the WMPs too, but even if you accept that, if that's where all the good stuff is, then I think those cities that choose that compliance path and that meet all of the strict requirements for timing and for oversight should be deemed in compliance, and that is a structure for the permit that structures it so that, as you noted on page 30 of the draft order, that a permittee will strive for compliance, because there's the carrot. So with that, I would urge you to stick with the original EWIMP on that point and reward those that strive for compliance on the regional basis. Thank you.
I have one question. If a city is told, will you approve where you're heading, and it doesn't work, you have, you're not meeting your water quality objectives, do we just live with that? I mean, you're not suggesting that, I don't think.
No, I'm not suggesting that, but what I am suggesting is that then at that point, if the reason it's not being met is because of a failure of the city or commitment of the city, that's a separate scenario from the fact that they did everything and it's not being met because, despite the best modeling, despite the reasonable assurances analysis, et cetera, that it nevertheless failed to meet it. At that point, I do think that the issue could be revisited within the context of the next permit cycle, but without exposing that city to immediately being out of compliance and exposing that city to litigation, which, as Mr. Monette said, it's not we don't foresee that it's always the NRDC or the baykeepers, or water keepers that are, the ones coming after cities. We see the potential for a lot more development in litigation than the standard stewards of the environment that are here today.
So you're acknowledging that there may be a need for future changes in BMPs or any, whatever is being done. But what you're asking for is that if the cities are pursuing those changes, should they need to happen, they should be deemed in compliance. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it should be deemed in compliance, but I think that it's a little more complex than that. It's not exactly that much of a cutoff, because there has to be a certain point. There needs to be a reasonable amount of time to let's see if the plan was actually working, and whether that period is 3 years or 6 years. It's really going to be hard to know until it's boots on the ground and we're out there working with some of these infiltration efforts and seeing what's actually accomplished.
Follow-up question. Again, I'm just trying to understand your recommendation. I think it's one thing to deem someone in compliance while they're implementing and taking actions to determine whether the objectives will be met. It's one thing to deem them in compliance at the end when we see that the limits are not being met. And if that's what you're suggesting?
I'm actually suggesting that the additional that the way the draft order is constructed now is actually a disincentive, because it doesn't have with it certainty at the end, and it doesn't seem to suggest that the uncertainty at the end will be something that'll be worked through before you get to the end. It really, the way it's drafted now, it seems to suggest we could get to the end, we could have followed all the rules, we could, even after drafting it, even after getting regional board approval, even after all of that, someone comes up and says, you know what, not good enough.
After all that, you do not meet the limits, how is it possible to deem you in compliance?
And that's, I think that you still need to leave that possibility open, because if the limits are impractical or practically, from a practical perspective, technically unattainable or impossible, and there's been a lot of discussion of that today, that you have to recognize that, even at the end.
I'm sorry, kick me off if you want to.
But no, it's an important question.
Because I think that this is a good discussion point. I think there's a value judgment here. It's like we're getting a lot of extra benefit out of doing the EWMP. There's a lot of above and beyond benefits, and that maybe that we need to decide that those benefits are worth getting the investment from the cities to put that in, that at the end of the day we might say they're deemed compliant.
But it's the end of the day, it's all in how you define end.
Right,
because when you said, I relaxed when you said next permit. So then I heard you saying for the life of the permit, and then I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember what the life of the permit. There's what life of the permit is in theory and then in practice.
Right.
It's 5, right? It's like a regular 5 permit. Okay.
I mean,
so we're talking about a 5-year chunk. I'm looking at Renee. We're doing hand signals. Yeah.
But conceivably, yeah, when you get done with the way my understanding from the permit, the way it's written today, is you get done with your EWMP plan as developed, and you've implemented all of the infrastructure necessary to infiltrate 85th percentile event in that watershed, then you're done. And maybe that's my misunderstanding, but is there a benefit to that that's above and beyond what you would get through the WMP process and eventually getting to the RWL compliance?
Well, no, that's where the end is the trick, because if you're saying for all time, forever, and we're gambling on it, that's a different thing than saying for a set period of time, we do the best we can and give people time to do those permits and stuff. But to just say, end of story, we're done, bye, things change in that much time. So I'm just trying to, I understand your point, legitimate point. I'm just trying to figure out how you navigate that with the ultimate long-term. And again, it's all in your time frame. There's some folks who say, we're late already, you know, no slack given, we've heard that. On the other hand, you can hear there's been an incredible amount of effort happening that's finally happening, so take yes for an answer. So then the question is, how do you, we're now into the details of it and how long, you know, to the extent that folks are talking about the practical realities of what they're doing and the challenges, that is very helpful in this workshop. But I also think there are words like end, term, whatever, that people can define in different ways, and that's why I'm asking the questions.
Well, and I think it's important to recognize that, yeah, we might get halfway through or 2/3 of the way through one of these plans and realize it's not going as well as we want it to, and we need to come back and adjust. But I think that's built into the draft order, that we can go to the executive officer and there would be an open process to get that kind of change, which I think we fully support that kind of approach.
And I appreciate this discussion, and it does revolve around, you know, in one place in the order, it's page 73, finding 10. But that idea that what if the EMWP is implemented and there's still exceedances of the receiving water limits? Well, that, as you pointed out, everyone here, you know, that's a time scale that's out there in the future quite a ways because of the turnover rate of the infrastructure that we discussed earlier as well. You know, the streets get put in over a certain time frame, et cetera. So I think we'll have an opportunity to look at language like we have in finding 10 to try to capture that idea of time scale more. So that, and I think that's our challenge, is to give the municipalities confidence that these investments are meaningful toward compliance, at the same time recognizing, you know, that we're not just assuming standards are met if our monitoring indicates otherwise, you know. And there are other remedies. I mean, you haven't, some commenters have touched on, you know, that, and that there's the issue of the feasibility of the standard itself. Hey, that's part of our system as well. You know, we don't shy away from that. And even today, we issued a site-specific objective for chloride in the sand, or whatever. You know, we approved the site-specific objective of chloride for a reach of the Santa Clara River in that spirit, you know, that we can look at standards down the road. So, you know, I don't think this action should in any way preclude that flexibility of future regional and state boards. And at the same time, you know, I don't think this language necessarily creates as much restriction, you know, in terms of piling on additional requirements at this stage and in this permit cycle of 5 years. So I think we can work through this.
Yeah.
ML, maybe you have
And
some
I was going to say that the regional board is going to speak at the end, and it might be actually helpful if we hear from them on what their intent was with the permit, because it's left pretty open-ended. And we read it as, I think maybe as the cities are reading it, you implement these requirements, the stormwater retention requirement, and you're done. We added the language that says you're not done if you don't get to water quality standards compliance, so you need to do more. It may not have been the regional board's intention, the way we read it, so if they don't mind speaking to it, I think that would be very helpful.
I'll step away. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Helpful. It's all illuminating. Next, Group D, Lawndale, Carson, Gardena, Compton, Irwindale, and West Covina, right to hear. Mr. Chair, your presentation is pretty much, these are your written comments.
Ma'am?
These are your written comments on your slides. Sorry, I did my homework already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, well, no, they're not. These are partially written comments. I have like, 9 volumes of written comments that you may look forward to. In any case, good afternoon, Madam Chair, board members, staff. It's always a pleasure seeing you. I prefer to be in Sacramento in many ways, because I love Sacramento, but I'm glad you're down here. In any case, the draft order is in response, obviously, to petitions challenging the MS4 permit. And we're grateful that the board has affirmed Water Quality Order 9905. But it doesn't make clear that the implementation of the Stormwater Management Program, or SWMP, and iterative process, which is associated with it, complies with the receiving water limitations. Though the LA permit complies with 9905 through Part 5A, the Regional Board effectively has switched off the SWMP and iterative process to spur permittees into complying with a more complicated and costly WIMP and EWIMP. Despite Part 5A, Regional Board staff said that if you opt for the SWMP, you must meet TMDL numeric targets at the outfall and in the receiving water, or be in violation of something that Renee mentioned earlier. And apparently the WIMP and the EWIMP are exempt from 9905, the 9905's receiving water limitation requirement, because the draft order says that the MS4 permit allows the WIMP and EWIMP as compliance pathways in lieu of meeting receiving water limitations. Maybe that's a mistake, but it appears to contradict other parts of the draft order that say otherwise. This violates 9905's receiving water limitation requirement, which must be in all MS4 permits, regardless if they use SWMPs, watershed improvement programs, drainage area management program plans, or WIMPs or EWIMPs. They all have to comply with receiving water limitations. That is the basis of 9905. Permittees that voluntarily opt for the EWIMP or WIMP therefore risk being in violation because they're not in compliance with 9905. So my recommendation, a simple recommendation, is to amend 9905 to include the EWIMP or WIMP, or direct the Regional Board to amend receiving water limitation section Part 5A to include an EWIMP or WIMP, and then everybody's happy. Okay, what are receiving water limitations? In the LA permit, receiving water limitation requirements are contained once again in Part 5A. Part 5A1 says, stormwater discharges from the MS4 shall not cause or contribute to a violation of receiving water limitations. Okay, that means shall not be violations of water quality standards or nuisances, or non-stormwater discharge prohibitions. VA2 says that stormwater and non-stormwater discharges from the MS4 of stormwater shall not cause or contribute to a condition of nuisance. That's a portico requirement. But Part 5A3 says that permittees can comply with Part 5A and A1 and 2 to avoid limitations. To avoid violations through the timely implementation of actions contained in a stormwater management program. And these are the core programs that are called out under federal regulations. Oh, by the way, I didn't advance my slide.
I was going to ask you if you wanted to.
Sorry, I was on a roll. The federal citation that I was referring to is projected up there. I wouldn't read it to you. But it says if a receiving water limitation persists despite SWMP implementation, a procedure known as the iterative process described in Part 5A3 must be implemented. And this includes submitting a monitoring report to the Regional Board describing BMPs and actions that have been taken, and proposing revised BMPs to prevent future exceedances. But the draft order appears unclear about this. It says that neither a safe harbor nor iterative process can forgive receiving water limitation violations, reflecting what the Ninth Circuit held in NRDC versus LA County Flood Control. The draft order also mentions that a good faith engagement of the iterative process can't forgive violations either. And this is in response to the receiving water limitation policy discussion options that were generated 2 years ago when those policy discussions began. By the way, these references are unnecessary and contribute to the impression that the iterative process is no longer valid. The draft order should delete them and make clear that the Stormwater Management Program iterative process prevents rather than avoids or forgives violations. The draft order disagrees with the permittee's view that the iterative process does or should constitute compliance with receiving water limitations. This must be a mistake. This sentence is located in a paragraph that affirms that the good faith engagement of the iterative process cannot forgive violations. Perhaps it meant to say that permittees should not conclude that the good faith implementation of the iterative process does not constitute compliance with receiving water limitations. To conclude otherwise would contradict 9905 and Water Quality Order 2001-15, which clarifies 9905, and would place every MS4 permit in the state, including Caltrans, in noncompliance. Here's what 2001-15 says. This board, your board, has already considered and upheld the requirement that the municipal water discharges must not cause or contribute to exceedances of water quality objectives that include standards in the receiving water. We adopted an iterative procedure for complying with this requirement, wherein municipalities must report instances where they cause or contribute to exceedances and then must review and improve BMPs so as to protect receiving waters. By the way, the iterative process cannot be abridged or avoided. It is not just a state requirement. It is mandated under federal rules, starting with Federal Register Volume 61 that was issued in 1996, and more recently in Federal Register Volume 79, which was issued last June. And it concluded that EPA views the MEP standard in the Clean Water Act as an iterative process. This explains, perhaps, why every MS4 permit in the nation has either an iterative process or an adaptive management provision. This includes those MS4 permits that have numeric WQ bells to meet TMDLs. And I can cite a number of examples of MS4s on the East Coast that have numeric WQ bells, that use flow reduction and pervious surface reduction as surrogate parameters meeting numeric WQ bells. But they're still subject to an iterative process. I think Lake Tahoe is similar in that regard as well. The draft order also asserts that the iterative process has been underutilized and ineffective to date in bringing the MS4 discharges into compliance with water quality standards. This is absolutely true. I was going to have Public Works Director from Mondale explain why that's the case, so I'm going to instead I'll explain it right now. The draft order suggests that the iterative process did not work under the previous permit. This is true, but it did not work for two reasons. First, the 2001 MS4 permit didn't require outfall monitoring, which is a federal requirement. Monitoring results from the county monitoring stations or in-stream in the channel could not point to any particular permittees for causing or contributing to an exceedance. This is because there are other dischargers upstream of them. In some cases, you have as many as 20. Some of them are MS4s, some are POTWs, some are industrial discharges, some are construction discharges, some of them are unpermitted discharges. So how in the world are you going to know who caused or contributed to what? Every year, permittees have to fill out an annual report, which asks the question, did you cause or contribute to an exceedance? I had to say no, because we don't have any data that shows that we actually had contributed to an exceedance, because that data really wasn't helpful. If it was outfall monitoring data, it would be very helpful, and we should have done that from the jump. Once we start generating outfall monitoring data on an annual basis, we will have a pretty good sense on the extent to which permittees are causing or contributing to exceedances of water quality standards. And we need to do that. I mean, this whole EWIMP stuff is jumping the gun because nobody has documented the problem yet. Okay. Numeric WQ bells set in the MS4 permit are improper. And the order does not respond favorably to the petitioner's contention that the LAMS4 permit failed to follow federal regulations and US EPA guidance when it translated TMDL numeric targets into numeric WQ bells and then made them the same as TMDL waste load allocations. The draft order validates the MS4 permit here by supporting the argument that the Regional Board properly set the numeric WQ bills when it established the TMDL. It says, at the permitting stage, the Regional Board's legal obligation was to develop WQ bills consistent with assumptions and requirements of any waste load allocation in the TMDL and not to consider reasonable potential. The order is saying because the Regional Board followed the process for setting a TMDL, it also met the requirement for setting numeric WQ bills. This statement is incorrect. Setting TMDL waste load allocations and determining WQ bills to meet them are two separate issues requiring compliance with two separate procedures under federal regulations. The Regional Board's actual legal obligation was to perform a reasonable potential analysis in accordance with that citation, which states effluent limitations must be set for all pollutants that are or may be discharged at a level that have a reasonable potential to cause an in-stream excursion above a narrative or numeric water quality standard. When considering the reasonable potential to cause an excursion above ambient criteria, which is dry weather, not wet weather, EPA regulations at the citation mentioned require that the regulatory authority consider factors such as existing controls on point and non-point sources, variability of the pollutant in the effluent, sensitivity of the species to toxicity testing, and dilution of the effluent in the receiving waters. The administrative record and the fact sheet for the LAMS4 permit mentions nothing about performing these tasks. The Regional Board also failed to point to the permittee outfall monitoring data demonstrating that discharges from the MS4 exceeded ambient dry weather standards, a criteria for any of the TMDL pollutants. All that was based on monitoring in stream from the county's mass emission stations. By the way, WQ bells are applied to the outfall discharges and not in the receiving water. The E in WQ bell stands for effluent, and effluent means outfall discharges. Surprisingly, the Caltrans MS4 permit is not subject to numeric WQ bills, despite the fact that Caltrans is subject to the same TMDLs as LAMS4 permittees. The State Board concluded that Caltrans need only, and this is in the Caltrans MS4, that Caltrans need only implement BMP WQ bills because of the TMDL assumptions and requirements it said were applicable to Caltrans. One of its assumptions is that Caltrans had relatively little contribution to the exceedances of those TMDLs. But the State Board apparently is not aware that a Caltrans monitoring report indicated that it persistently exceeded TMDLs. For example, in its 2002-2003 annual report, it showed that Caltrans exceeded copper 85 out of 89 samples and 86 out of 89 samples for zinc. These samples, by the way, were based on outfall monitoring measured against ambient CTR standards. Because cities were not required to conduct outfall monitoring under the 2001 permit, few exceedances of the TMDLs at the outfalls have ever been reported. So why are we jumping to numeric WQ bills and WIMPs and EWIMPs in order to comply with them? There's an obvious disparity here. What's good for the goose has got to be for the gander. Permittees should be entitled to BMP-based WQ bills. The draft order also disagrees with the petitioner's contention that the LA permit should not require using the phrase prohibiting non-stormwater discharges through the MS4 and instead should use to or into the MS4. The order says it is a distinction without a difference. This is untrue. It's a problem with syntax and logic. The MS4 consists of streets, catch basins, storm drains, and other structures, natural or man-made, that convey runoff to receiving water. You don't prohibit discharges through streets or through catch basins or through storm drains, but instead to or into them. Using through the MS4 will make enforcement more difficult. How can a non-permitted discharger prohibit its discharges through a street or catch basin? Using through is also inconsistent with Clean Water Act Section 402(b)(2), which says that MS4 permits shall include a requirement to effectively prohibit non-stormwater discharges into storm sewers, same as MS4. All other MS4 permits issued in the state include the including the Caltrans permit, use the term to or into the MS4. The draft order also disagrees with the petitioner's contention that the LA permit cannot require compliance with dry weather or non-stormwater discharges with TMDLs. The order and the MS4 permit do not point to state or federal law requiring permittee compliance with non-stormwater outfall discharges measured against TMDLs. 402PB3 says that non-stormwater discharges, 2 says that non-stormwater discharges of the MS4 are prohibited. They do not require them to be controlled to the same extent as stormwater discharges are per 402PB3. Federal regulations require a procedure for observing non-stormwater discharges according to that citation, and if detected, requires sampling the discharge to identify the pollutant and track upstream its sources. This was not a requirement under the previous MS4 permit, by the way. If the discharge is traced to a discharger, the permittee must either prohibit the discharge through its legal authority or require a permittee to obtain a discharge permit, but not from the permittee. Eliminating a non-stormwater discharge of the MS4 eliminates the transport mechanism for conveying pollutants, including TMDLs, to receiving water. The draft order also challenges assertions made by several petitioners that the federal regulations only require effluent and ambient monitoring for compliance purposes. The order refutes petitioner's argument by relying on that citation, arguing that it applies to situations where a state has not established a water quality objective for a pollutant present in the effluent. The draft order is incorrect here. The foregoing federal citation actually says the permit requires all effluent and ambient monitoring necessary to show that during the term of the permit, limit on the indicator parameter continues to attain and maintain applicable water quality standards. This clearly applies to compliance monitoring. The reference to applicable water quality standards means that the state has already established a water quality objective. For example, the TMDLs are ambient water quality standards, as is the case through the California Toxics Rule. The draft order ignores petitioner's reference to that citation, which establishes that the outfall is a place where compliance with water quality standards is determined. It requires the identification of locations for sampling. The draft order supports the MS4 permit requirement that compliance with wet weather TMDL waste load allocations is legal. However, your own board order says, this is 2001-15, there is no provision in state or federal law that mandates adoption of separate water quality standards for wet weather conditions. All water quality standards, including TMDLs, are ambient standards. There are other issues here, and this is really important. Part 5A refers to the WIMP and EWIMP, but it can't because the MS4 permit section in Part 5A says it applies only to the SWIMP. The draft order says that if a permittee does not comply with the approved compliance schedule associated with the WIMP or EWIMP, it must instead demonstrate immediately compliance with receiving water limitations in Part 5A of the MS4 permit. Another conflict that you need to address is that this can't be because Part VA is the SWIMP iterative process. Does this mean if a permittee's WIMP or EWIMP does not meet the compliance schedule, it will have to switch to the SWIMP in its iterative process to comply with receiving water limitations? Something's amiss here and needs to be fixed. The draft order also said the implementation of the WIMP EWIMP constitutes in lieu of compliance of receiving water limitations. We've already indicated that that's a contradiction. Throughout the draft order, there are references to the WIMP EWIMP complying with Part 5A of the permit, which again requires compliance with receiving water limitations through the SWIMP iterative process. If the State Board wants the EWIMP or WIMP to be covered under Part 5A, it needs to amend 9905 or direct the Regional Board to amend Part 5A. Regarding the safe harbor, the safe harbor cannot forgive violations on the one hand, but on the other, say that the safe harbor applies to the EWIMP during the planning phase. Either it applies or it doesn't apply. This conflict must be resolved. Let me talk about costs real quickly. And by the way, the city manager for the city of Lawndale has a 60-second presentation that he would like to make in connection with those costs. Check those costs out. This is from the city WIMP group in the East San Gabriel River. Meeting the 2017 milestones, $3 to $4 million per city. Meeting the 2020 milestones, $34.6 million per city. Meeting the 2023 milestones, almost $60 million per city. Only 4 cities. All of these cities are located upstream of spreading grounds, and none of them are really subject to any TMDLs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Obviously, staff will go through all the.
Sorry?
Staff will go through all of the things you raised. Some, maybe some semantics, and we'll see.
Chairman Marcus, members of the board, good afternoon. My name is Mitch Lansdale. I am the city manager of the city of Gardena. I've learned a lot today, more surprising than what I had actually come to say. The amounts for compliance in what's been reported here is an enormous cost to any city in order to meet this. And what I'm asking, according to our city attorney, the water board should take costs into account when promulgating the MS4 permit requirements. He cites in a memorandum issued by then State Board Senior Staff Counsel to the State Board, Elizabeth Jennings, which has been viewed favorably by the courts. Ms. Jennings wrote, to achieve the maximum extent practical, standard municipalities must employ whatever best management practices that are technologically feasible, likely to be effective, and are not cost prohibitive, taking into account factors such as effectiveness, regulatory compliance, public acceptance, cost, and technical feasibility. What I'm here to ask the board, State Board, to consider is taking costs and their impact on city programs and services into account when you make your final regulations. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Next, Group E, Gateway Water Management Authority, Grace Cast.
Good afternoon.
You're not really Group E, you're...
Yeah, that's fine.
You're just E.
Hope you enjoyed your taquitos.
Yeah,
my lunch was really good, too. I'm Grace Cast. I'm the Executive Officer of the Gateway Water Management Authority. We are a joint powers authority made up of 26 cities and water agencies, representing Southeast Los Angeles County. We serve over 2 million residents, with over 1 million of them residing in disadvantaged communities. We heard the term earlier today from Mr. Farfsing. It's the epicenter, and I decided to steal that one because that's a good one. As the agency responsible for coordinating and addressing watershed-related issues in our region, we are uniquely qualified to comment on the impacts of the WIMPs. Our Joint Powers Authority serves as the fiduciary agent in 4 watersheds, and we are in the process of entering into MOU amendments to implement the 4 WIMPs. The draft order leaves unanswered the question of whether the WIMPs and EWIMPs are financially feasible. Many of the Gateway region cities have a median household income that is at or below the state's definition of disadvantaged communities, a term that was recognized by the voters of this state just last month in approving Proposition 1. Based upon U.S. Census data and other data collected by the U.S. Conference of Mayors just within the last few months, we believe that at least 14 cities in our Gateway region fall below, with the others right behind it. To impose additional costs of new water infrastructure projects designed to meet the exacting requirements of the 2012 permit is to impose a significant burden on such communities and their citizens. These cities struggle to fund basic municipal services, let alone the hundreds of millions of dollars needed to comply with numeric limits in the WIMPs and to construct the best management practices. The administrative record contains a number of reports that detail the adverse socioeconomic factors in the Gateway region cities. These reports point out that there is a, quote, affordability crisis that we are now facing, and the growing costs of regulations for water, wastewater, stormwater. These costs have been ignored by the silo fashion that federal and state regulators have taken when issuing water regulations and permits. To that end, we suggest that the State Board make an express commitment, if not in the draft order, than in its planning documents for Proposition 1 funds to offset the current and future anticipated high costs of permit compliance. We believe that the draft order can further the goals of the State Board and assist the cities in implementing stormwater programs in a cost-effective manner while recognizing the challenges faced by the disadvantaged communities and ensuring that the WIMPs and EWIMPs are affordable to all Californians. So we have 3 recommendations. The tentative order should state that the costs of implementing the WIMPs should not exceed EPA's affordability threshold of 4.5% in any one 5-year permit cycle. Second, the water board should consider granting additional flexibility to watersheds that include state-designated disadvantaged communities. Additional flexibility would include granting additional compliance time and not requiring TSOs. And 3, the State Board should work with the cities to mitigate the economic impacts on households from the WIMPs and EWIMPs. This would include assisting cities in identifying and securing funding. The State Board made a conclusion in the tentative order stating that the LA order strikes a, quote, balance at this stage in our stormwater programs, but expect that we will continue to revisit the question of appropriate balance as the Water Board's experience in implementing watershed-based solutions to stormwater grows, unquote. The Gateway Water Management Authority believes that the WIMPs and EWIMPs must include a recognition of the financial hardships facing our disadvantaged communities and their watershed partners in order to truly provide that balance that the State Board is seeking. And I conclude to that end that we look forward to our continued relationship with the State Board. You've been extremely helpful to us in the past in our stormwater projects, and we hope to continue that partnership on similar grant programs stemming from Proposition 1. And I really appreciate you coming down here. Thank you.
Great, thank you as well.
And just I put a map up there just to show you the hot red spots we've got in the Gateway region. It's not pretty.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next, Richard Watson. Hello, Mr. Watson.
Just wait for the PowerPoint if I may. Thank you. Chair Marcus and members of the board, I'm before you today to give you, which way does it go? This way. Perspective of a planner who's been involved in this process for some time, involved in 3 of the watershed management programs. And a little bit of a disagreement, I think, with Mr. Fleischle. He had indicated that the watershed management programs don't contain the same elements necessarily that the EWIMPs do. The one that I'm the prime consultant on is based on two major things, source control and water capture. And the budget that we've told the cities, $332 million for 17,711 acres, is because of water capture. And so we are really attempting to do those sorts of things. I'd also indicate that I think we're basically doing what NRDC said they wanted. We've got a pretty rigorous set of plans. They've been reviewed actually by the environmental groups and the regional boards, and we're responding to those comments. They're pretty transparent since they have commented on them. And the models we're using for the RAAs, or our consultants are basically peer-reviewed models, one of which was co-funded, I believe, by Gila Bay, and the other one was funded by EPA. So they've been reviewed by several people. Oh, wrong way, excuse me. How does this work there? Just a little bit of an overview. The watershed groups really have invested a lot of time and money in this process, and they're trying to make the watershed program concept work. And I think your decision, your decision to uphold the permit with a number of provisions or revisions really supports that investment. And I have a couple of additional suggestions to make at the end of my presentation. Before I do that, I'd like to thank you for a couple things. One, you really did recognize that stormwater is complex and difficult and requires innovative approaches and significant investment of resources, and that's absolutely true. And you also discuss on page 76 the need for balance between enforcement and giving us enough time to get things done. And those have been mentioned by some other folks today, too. Paradigm shift has been mentioned earlier as primarily a source to, or shift to water as a resource. Some of these points before you are part of the paradigm shift faced by the municipalities, the permittees. Going to an emphasis on watershed approach, working together, having to work together a little more than they did in the past. This whole shift to green infrastructure, the nature of the plans that we're doing are pretty rigorous. And I've listed there a few of the elements of them. The monitoring, mentioned earlier, much more extensive, much more expensive. I think in our watershed, it's going to be 5 times as many sites. And then the programs have gone from a fairly low-cost program to a much more expensive program. We talked earlier also, you recognize complexity. Here are some of the elements of complexity. A lot of cities are in multiple watersheds. And basically in this region, we're dealing with the built environment. We're not out on the edge. We're in the built environment. We have to look for opportunities. And we've also got a problem with priorities changing and potentially imposed priorities. The trash amendments, I think, will become an imposed priority on us when those are adopted. Changing pesticides. I mentioned the shifting of infrastructure. One of the big ones is lack of local control of many pollutants. And Casca's here today. They may be talking about their source control initiatives. And we've talked about copper and brake pads before, but there are a lot of other pollutants that are impacted by that. I do want to talk a little bit about the receiving water limitations. I have 2 specific proposals. One, we've mentioned the cause or contribute language before. Perhaps you could change that to cause or significantly contribute. Somebody earlier mentioned the molecule problem. One little discharge of something and you're in trouble. The second one is perhaps you can combine the various elements, 1, 2, and 3 in Part 5A into one paragraph so that the courts don't break them apart again. On the numeric water quality standards, you recognize that we may not be able to achieve them in the near term. I maintain that the same problems are in effect for the medium and long term, and I'd ask you to ask your staff to come up with some more flexibility. One way of doing that has been mentioned earlier today, deemed compliance, and you acknowledge that in part of the order, and it worked well for the LA River Trash TMDL, but I think that maybe the staff could come up with other ways of doing it for other portions of the order. And lastly, I'd just like to mention that, again, time and money are major factors. They're particularly important for the built environment where we do have to seek opportunities. They're not coming at us. And the costs of implementing these plans is very expensive. Thank you.
Your PowerPoint started late, so you don't have to cut off your comment if you wanted to wrap up.
Just a couple more things. We really do need flexibility on the timing issue, just because we are looking for innovative approaches. I know I'm approaching a couple different companies who are looking at technologies where we want to run pilot projects. These take time to put together, and we think, in particularly bacteria was mentioned earlier. To me, that's the long-term, almost impossible thing to solve right now for wet weather, and that's the one we're really kind of focused on in the long run. So we need your help on financing too. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, I have a question for staff. So we use the term cause or contribute to very commonly in many elements of our regulatory programs to protect water quality. It's always been my understanding that contribute to is a signal to noise question. It's never been a molecule question, ever, in terms of our implementation. Does anyone want to offer some thoughts on that?
Did you say signal to noise? Or
Signal to noise. So can you see the signal above the noise in terms of a contribution on a mass basis to the water quality in the receiving water? That's how if it's noise, it's hard to make a case that you've contributed to water quality impairment if there's not, a signal that you can point to in your data.
Phil Wiles. Yeah, I think that's actually a good way to put it. I don't think I've ever heard it framed exactly that way, but.
He's a musician. As well as an engineer, both work.
Right. And yeah, in application, first of all, I don't think you would detect the molecule. And so in fact, yeah, there is some notion of significance, if you will, that's incorporated in effect. But you're right, we've used the phrase cause or contribute. It comes from the EPA regs for reasonable potential, but we've used that consistently, and frankly, I've never seen it abused in the way that some people seem to be afraid that it could be abused by the agencies or by anybody else, frankly.
Questions? All right, let's move on. This has all been very helpful. Appreciate all of you. Next, Group G, County of Orange, County of San Diego, Riverside Flood Control and Water Conservation District. And we have both Richard Boone and Jason Yulee, right? Yulee?
Substituting for Jason. I'll introduce myself.
Hi.
Is the PowerPoint? Just. All right, good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the board. I'm the first of three speakers. I'm Richard Boone with the Orange County Stormwater Program. First, did I say good afternoon? We join with Casca and the other commentators in stressing the need for a regulatory framework that provides a genuine opportunity for municipal compliance. We agree with the 7 principles for the future permitting of stormwater in other counties, such as Orange and Riverside and San Diego, that are presented in the draft order. However, unless principles 1 and 2 are expressly set forth, I'm not sure that we are resolving our basic fundamental concern, because we know it's the position of the courts to review every provision of the permit independently. Implicit in the order, and to an extent explicit, is an understanding of the unique challenges presented by the urban runoff control. An alternative compliance pathway is described. However, it seems that the opportunity for any entity to directly enforce for non-attainment of a water quality standard at any time at least appears to me to be preserved based on the Ninth Circuit decision. As you consider finalizing the order, I would ask you that you consider the following. There is a statement in the order that the iterative process has been underutilized and ineffective to date in bringing MS4 discharges into compliance. I think that the actual history of stormwater management is more positive. Following 20 years of infrastructure and program investment, surf zone water quality along the entire Southern California coastline I think has really been transformed. Concurrently, as a consequence of the work of a number of people in this room, a bill was passed that is going to phase out copper in brake pads. So copper is being and brake pads really are the single #1 source of copper in the urban environment. Copper is being removed from brake pads. And concern for water quality really is increasingly informing the regulation of pesticide use, both at the state level and the federal level. Low impact development, I think, is now standard practice. So while clearly there is more work to be done, I think there are nonetheless some notable accomplishments that we can point to. I'd like to address the complaint that the draft order provides a safe harbor. The safe harbor, for me, really is the Loch Ness monster of environmental regulation. It simply has never existed, and it's a legal misnomer.
Why don't you have a slide, for God's sake? There was an opportunity there.
Yeah, I did. You're right. I did think long and hard about that.
That won't come out of your time, I swear.
Yeah, okay. The MS4...
I think we should get extra time for that.
Yeah.
40 to 45 minutes?
Yeah.
It wasn't that good.
So MS4 permits these days are very substantial documents. I think the Orange County permit is around 160 or 180 pages. And the receiving water limitations language really is just simply one requirement of many. and substantial fines have been levied by the regional boards for failure to comply with these other provisions that have no reference to the receiving water limitations provisions. These enforceable provisions remain enforceable. They're not affected by the draft order. And for interested parties, I mean, the compliance status of municipal programs is laid bare every year in these very comprehensive, very detailed annual regulatory self-audit reports. So I now want to talk a little bit about fecal indicator bacteria, since it's the most frequent cause of water quality impairment in the United States. And there is a growing concern about our ability to attain water contact recreational standards in all conditions. So let's see. Actually, that was Benjamin Franklin. I'm sorry about that.
A whole beer set of slides I've been using, so thank you for that.
It's Benjamin Franklin.
There's also the no water, no beer quote.
So I'm just, because time is short, I'm just going to go to two slides that I think really, for me, talk to the conundrum that is at the heart of the stormwater mandate, or one of the conundrums. This is a basin in South Orange County, Hornell Basin, a large basin for flood control and also for water quality management. And in dry weather conditions, you can see that the effluent, the pale blue line, is close to the recreational contact standard, and the water that is influent to the basin exceeds the standard by many orders of magnitude. So there's a very deliberate, a very obvious water quality benefit to that basin in dry weather. But the situation gets reversed in wet weather. So the two plots there, the basin is full, and you can see that the inflow water coming in towards the end of the monitoring period there actually is lower than the effluent. So the basin acts as a very effective sink for bacteria in dry weather, but it becomes a source of bacteria and a problem from the point of view of compliance with a recreational standard in wet weather. So this is another piece of work, another project that we did, and I credit my colleague Kason Clapper for doing the monitoring here. This was a channel restoration where we had a channel in a regional park. It was a trapezoidal riprap channel. We reconfigured the channel, widened it, and planted it. So again, in dry weather, it's a very effective sink for bacteria, and you can see the difference there between the water coming in the dark blue line and the water coming out the pale blue line. Oops, going the wrong way again. But in wet weather, we have the same situation. So this section of channel, which I think represents a very desirable ecological outcome in terms of how we have reconditioned or reconfigured a portion of the MS4, the drainage system, is delivering good biology. It's delivering something that perhaps Audubon would get excited about, but you can see that that channel section is now operating as a source of bacteria in high flows. So we have a water quality liability.
Okay, so just so that I get it, so you're just suggesting that we look at wet weather and dry weather differently?
As you say, as you set your neural network to consider the issues here, just think about wet weather versus dry weather, and think about standards where we might want to be creating these types of ecological outcomes, but at the same time realizing that we're creating a water quality liability for ourselves. So there are many sections of coastline close to attaining Hilda Bay's A grade at all times in the recreational season, but only up to 70% of the time in wet weather. In the ASCE Omnibus report, Pathogens in Urban Stormwater Systems, it concluded that depending on the sources of fecal indicator bacteria affecting a particular receiving water and the manner in which MS4 compliance is assessed, dry weather standards may be attainable, but consistently attaining standards under wet weather conditions may be ultimately infeasible. It's really important that we recognize that studies, modeling, and analyses may lead to the conclusion that current standards cannot be achieved in all times and in all water bodies. Indeed, as the ASCE report points out, fecal indicator bacteria, TMDL endpoints, will almost certainly differ from 100% compliance with recreational water quality objectives. Finally, I would note that MEP is still the foundation of this program. The 85th percentile runoff volume standard, retention standard, needs to be retained as a compliance endpoint in MS4 permits. It was established through a robust engineering analysis that showed that the capture of incrementally larger volumes accrued very little additional environmental benefit, but a lot of very significant additional expense. It is a challenging but nonetheless valuable management endpoint or option for watershed management. Moreover, this standard is not only an artifact of MS4 permits, but has been incorporated into the CEQA process as the benchmark test of mitigation for water quality impacts. So we would urge you to retain this compliance endpoint. So to conclude my portion, and hopefully my colleagues get an extra couple of minutes for the Loch Ness Monster diversion, the 7 principles established in the draft order for other regional water boards to consider in creating compliance pathways for future MS4 permits, I think are robust. However, we would request some further refinements to the draft order that will enable regional water boards to create compliance pathways that reflect local conditions and priorities, ensure the realization of meaningful environmental outcomes, and obviously incur no loss of accountability, and ultimately satisfactorily resolve what I think is the receiving water limitation jeopardy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus, members of the board. I will try to be quick and not repeat things that Richard said. So let me just first say, completely supportive of all of Orange County's comments. Let the record reflect that. So the County of San Diego, my name is Todd Snyder. I'm manager of the Watershed Protection Program for the County of San Diego. The county is generally supportive of an alternative compliance pathway with the receiving water limitations, and we very much appreciate the State Board staff has taken a step in that direction. But I would like to highlight a few things where we still have some concerns with how the order is written. First of all, something that Richard didn't hit on is we feel really strongly that the order should go beyond just guidance. We really think it should be a directive to local regional boards to offer an alternative compliance pathway, something we sorely need in the San Diego region. Our MS4 permit was adopted back in 2013. There was an alternative compliance pathway proposed on the table, but ultimately it did not get adopted. So we would really encourage you to take that next step and make it a directive rather than a suggestion. Our second major concern is that any alternative compliance pathway that does ultimately get put into a permit needs to be achievable in practice. So I would share a lot of the concerns that Richard raised about the technical feasibility, particularly with respect to the wet weather bacteria issue. In San Diego, that's a big deal. We've got a lot of TMDLs in the San Diego region, but the biggest one by far is a wet weather and dry weather bacteria TMDL for both beaches and creeks that affects 6 watersheds. About 15 jurisdictions are affected by the TMDL. Back in 2012, we put together our implementation plans to sort of map out the compliance way forward. A lot of structural is needed to get you there from the modeling perspective, and the compliance cost estimates for the county region-wide were between $3 and $5 billion with a B. So we're talking significant money. And it's not even clear, based on some of the issues that Richard has brought up, that if we make that investment, that at the end of the day we'll have a compliance endpoint. So generally, I would just like to say we need to be bringing costs. We need to be bringing return on investment more into this discussion, I think, than it is now. Ultimately, we're answerable to the taxpayers. If we haven't already, we'll be going out to get additional funds for our stormwater programs. And in addition to being good stewards of the environment and of water quality, we need to be good stewards of taxpayer money and build the public trust. Because over the long term, to garner that long-term support for stormwater programs, we're going to need to make sure that we build confidence with the public and build that public trust. So there may be a point, and I think this should be part of the discussion, where throwing additional money at a problem might not be the right public policy, might not make sense, even if ultimately the standards aren't achieved. I'm not saying we're there today, but I'm saying we could be there, and it needs to be part of this discussion. Just the real quick last point, related to how the San Diego permit is set up, very similar to the watershed management plans in LA, we have water quality improvement plans. One of the things we really like about them is that they focus on prioritizing resources on the top priorities. So your limited resources are put to the issues that make the most sense. The way the discussion's going today, you potentially could get some protection over a period of time if you're implementing something equivalent to an EWIMP or a WIMP for the pollutants in the geographic areas covered by the plan. I would ask, what about those lower priorities that aren't part of your watershed plan? It would seem to me that it's sort of backwards, and you would have immediate compliance vulnerability for those things that might be lower priorities than the issues that you're actually focusing on in your plan. So figuring out to get the order to address that issue in some way would be important. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve Horn with Riverside County.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus, members of the board. My name is Steve Horn. I'm with the County of Riverside, and I have the pleasure of pinch hitting and batting cleanup. So Jason unfortunately couldn't stick around, so I'm reading his testimony into the record for himself and behalf of Riverside County Flood Control and Water Conservation District. And I'd also like to say thank you very much for your efforts here, staff and the board. We really appreciate it. Thank you. The cities and county, state, and regional boards all serve the same public. The public expects a healthy environment and livable communities. We are all partners in providing those outcomes. The question is, how do we do that effectively? From that perspective, we think the order needs to do 4 things. First, it needs to provide a path to compliance, and we are encouraged by the directive to the water boards in the order. Second, it needs to provide the permittees with the ability to focus limited resources on our highest priority issues so that we can move the bar forward effectively. And third, to Board Member Moore's comment regarding Santa Clarita Chlorine TMDL, it also needs to recognize the fact that basin plans are not perfect, and that alternative compliance path requires us to document that we can reasonably attain all standards. In addition, the order needs to provide the regional boards with the flexibility to determine where an alternative standard of compliance may be appropriate to address potentially outdated standards or other issues. We also need a policy and resource commitment to address basin plan issues from the water boards. I think that will help everything moving forward. Lastly, there needs to be a recognition that the whole world more or less drains into the MS4, but the MS4s, can't control the world.
Wait, what was it? The whole world drains into MS4s, but MS4s can't what?
Can't control the world.
Control the world.
The land use equation.
Right. Yeah.
So some discharges come from state and federal lands. Others are regulated under other regional permits, regional board permits. In some cases, the MS4 is used to wheel water supplies from one location to the other, water transfers. So we'd like a commitment from the water boards to help address these inputs to the MS4 to ensure that they do not cause or contribute violations of our permits. Lastly, we'll be submitting additional comments via written testimony as well. And again, we're available for questions, and thank you very much for your time and support in this effort.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I actually have a question for Todd. I think I didn't understand your last point, because he was just saying, let's put our limited resources on our highest priorities, and were you saying that may be backwards?
Well, no. So I support prioritization very much. What I was referring to is there's language in the order that says you're only deemed in compliance with receiving water limitations for those pollutant water body combinations that are addressed in your plan. And what I'm saying is there may be other constituents out there in the watersheds that aren't addressed in your plan because they haven't been deemed a high priority. Yet the receiving water limitations, as I read the order, would still apply to those things. So pollutants that we're not necessarily prioritizing in terms of going after and putting resources on, yet the same causing and contributing language applies, and the same vulnerabilities to lawsuits and enforcement would apply on those non-priority pollutants.
Mel, you want to address that? I know we could, there, we could have you talking all day to address everything everybody said, but that's interesting.
It is an interesting point, and the regional board's order requires prioritization or allows for prioritization within the WIMPs, EWIMPs. So you are not necessarily addressing every pollutant that may be for which there may be exceedances. You're only deemed in compliance with the receiving water limitations for a pollutant that's addressed in your WIMP, EWIMP. So this is not something that we considered in our order. There might be pollutants for which there are exceedances that are we're requiring immediate compliance with the receiving water limitations because they're not a priority. So it is a slightly, it's a dilemma.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So it's something we'll think about. John, did you want to?
So I agree with that you might not prioritize it and do solutions, but you should be recognizing it in your plans as a lower priority and be part of your plans.
Yeah, that's one way to solve it.
That's always been my assumption. I could be wrong about that.
And in the Caltrans permit and the TMDL implementation this year, staff and John was part of that, grappled a bit with the idea of that there's a lot of pollutants in water bodies in the Caltrans universe. And was compelling to me, and maybe this is some assurance to that concern, is that there's a logic, in the BMP selection to grouping pollutant classes. Those that are hydrophobic tend to, adhere to sediment, and then sediment-controlled BMPs are more effective for that type of class. And we won't go any further than that, but just that to the extent that that kind of sophistication exists, and I believe it does, at the local MS4 management level, I want to encourage, through prioritization, recognizing that there are, let's say, multiple, benefits to certain strategies that really address a whole class of pollutants and not just a pollutant by pollutant type prioritization.
Good point. Okay, great. I'm going to use, thank you very much. I'm going to use chair's prerogative to let two individual, hopefully you don't mind, Jeff and Susan. We have two students with us who wanted to speak. I want to give them their 3 minutes now because they have to go. I'm not going to do that for everybody. It's a student bias. I'm sorry. And don't you all become students so that you can go too. So, Jonathan McKay.
That's correct.
Or Mackey? Or McKay?
Mackay.
Mackay, there you go. Okay, make me proud.
Okay.
You got 3 minutes.
Okay. Well,
Prove me right. Prove me right.
Thank you very much for letting me speak today. My name is Jonathan Mackay, and I'm a resident of Santa Monica, California. And I think it's important that you know that residents are following these issues. So I'm an environmental scientist, scuba diver, wildlife photographer, cyclist, and in general, I enjoy the beaches and the oceans and the rivers in LA. However, every time it rains, toxic heavy metals, oil, trash, fecal bacteria are washed into municipal storm drains, leading to rivers, eventually ending up in our oceans, causing beach closures, essentially keeping me off the beach and out of the water. Additionally, urban runoff from overwatering, illegal waste dumping, from construction sites, commercial sites, are increasing toxins in our oceans and exceeding water quality standards in Los Angeles. The current MS4 permits allow municipalities to exceed water quality standards so long as they've engaged in watershed management approach. I asked the board to remove the safe harbor provisions in the current MS4 permits and hold municipalities accountable to abide by water quality standards to help protect LA water bodies from the harmful impacts of stormwater and non-stormwater pollution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us and for being here all day. Appreciate it. Next, Alicia Murphy. Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Alicia Murphy. I'm a water advocate and musician currently living in LA, but I studied hydrology at UC Davis, recently earned my degree last year, and for the past year, I've been working as a groundwater and stormwater sampling technician for a private sampling company throughout LA County. And I can go ahead and say, as boots on the ground, that it's poor conditions out there. And I have also worked with numerous state agencies, Delta Stewardship Council, Delta Conservancy, and various conservation groups. And through this work, I've experienced and witnessed the complicated systems that you're all working in. And I really appreciate you all for being here today and taking your time to work through this. But I would like to urge the board, as a concerned resident of LA and someone who has a decent understanding of what's happening in the water systems in California, that you really take the time to make sure that the Clean Water Act and protecting the water and not having safe harbors is a priority in this permit. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us. Nice to see you again. Great. Next we have Casca. Yeah, are you guys going to go in tandem, or you're just walking across the front, Cass?
They're going to start dancing in a minute.
I'm a student of State Water Board.
Do you think we behave differently here than we do up there? Yeah.
That's our Abbey Road moment. We only had two members, so. Steve got that. You're a musician, so you got that. Good afternoon, Chair Marcus and board members. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about the petitions before us today. I'm Jeff Brosseau. I'm the Executive Director for the California Stormwater Quality Association, or CASQA. Here to talk about the RWLs, receiving limitations language. This is a topic that's been near and dear to our heart for a number of years, actually. Turns out I couldn't believe that the last workshop was actually 2 years ago, not just 1 year ago, but that's the truth, I'm afraid. So we're glad to hear that we're dealing with it today and in the months going forward. We bring a little different perspective to this issue, obviously, because we're a statewide association, so we're thinking about, obviously, how it affects the LA permittees, but also permittees throughout the state as well. So I'll try and bring that kind of flavor to the conversation as well. And we're also obviously looking at it from the potentially precedent-setting aspects of the order as well. Let's see if I get this right here. CASQA generally supports the draft order. We appreciate the consistency with and the consideration of CASQA's approach to this. We actually took it upon ourselves at one point several years ago to come up with what we call the Strategic Compliance Program. Same thing as an alternative compliance pathway. It's a little bit different, but same idea. And provide that to the board. And so we're very appreciative of the fact that what's in the draft order, what's in the original permit, and in what's in our approach is very similar. Actually, I'll show you the similarities here in a second. I also personally, I think, and talking with my colleagues, found that the order was very thoughtfully written, and it was actually a very nice, easy read. I couldn't believe it actually a ton of. Oh, this is great. If this was a book, I'd actually probably buy it. It was. So I appreciate that.
You are
Thank
kind
you.
of a nerd.
Thank you for the.
I have to say, you're in the most appropriate job possible there, obviously, but also it was well written.
I feel like I really understood what the author was thinking, which was very helpful in terms of, okay, here's my conclusions. Okay, I get that. So that was helpful. There's 3 areas of consideration we'd like you to think about, and obviously we'll put these in our comments due on the 21st of January. One is obviously the implications for other permittees in the state beyond the LA permittees, and this issue has already come up once about the issue of exposure to those that don't have some kind of a strategic compliance pathway in their own permit. The second is the issue of compliance through stormwater retention, the 85th percentile issue that you've heard about already. And then finally, the application of water quality standards to stormwater. And the challenge is when you get to that point where you say, gosh, we've done all this work and we still haven't got there, now what do we do? And we've got some ideas about, as managers, what do you do in that situation? And it's not obviously unique to stormwater management. It's a pretty typical management policy point that you come to down the road. just to give you a sense of what Casca's approach looks like, it's very similar to what, I think we all agreed several years ago that the iterative approach was not working very well because in general it was written fairly loose. It basically said when you have a problem, get smarter, work harder, do better. Okay, we'll try that. And some people did and some people maybe didn't do that. So I think we all agreed that it was time to add some rigor to that process, some definition. And actually probably the key point to that is actually provide that definition up front. Before you get into the problem situation, you say, if and when we have a problem, here's the path we're going to follow in a more rigorous, systematic way. And that's actually kind of part and parcel to the approach that we came up with. It talks about the idea that you have to be able to prioritize pollutants. Not all pollutants are important. If you focus on pollutants that are not important, you have lost opportunity costs for ones that are more important. It talks about having a RWL, good faith compliance. The idea of having more accountability in the system so people can really, and more ease of accountability is really comes down to. And some assurance that if you follow a good faith process, that you will be in compliance during that time period because you are making an effort and you're trying to get there. Setting aside what happens when you get to the 85th percentile point at some point. That's very similar actually to what's in the LA permit and the alternative compliance pathway and in the draft order as well. It definitely allows compliance over time. It recognizes a time implementation, constitutes compliance, and encourages a watershed approach, which we're all looking for, particularly when we're in a drought situation. It recognizes that it's okay to prioritize. That's not a bad word necessarily. And that there are regional differences, of course, across the state as well. Going to our three kind of issues, and the way this is structured, I'll give you the issue and give our recommendation, basically. As I say, we are concerned for those in the state, those permittees in the state who don't have something that would look like an alternative compliance pathway. I work in the Bay Area. We actually have something that's kind of similar to this. It's actually in the permit language itself. It's not actually a plan. It's actually in the permit provisions themselves. So we have some coverage there in the Bay Area, but many permits do not, including the Phase 2 permit that this board has issued as well. So we think that the ultimate solution should have some compliance pathway for all MS4 permits. And as somebody said earlier, that is spoken to, I think, on page 48 of the draft order in Section 7 conclusions. It says basically it directs the regional boards to consider the WMP, EWMP approach on the next permit cycle. We would strengthen that to say that you shall actually review your permits now and look to see whether you have a compliance pathway. And if you don't, consider opening the permits up now and putting that pathway in there. And then I think we have to recognize that the LA approach isn't necessarily feasible to develop. You heard about the cost of developing these plans. It's quite extensive. I'm thinking of small towns up and down the state trying to do the same kind of thing. Unlikely it's going to work very well. So that's why we suggested in our approach that you have something that's called a strategic compliance program. And it might actually be permit provisions that are pre-written ahead of time that say, if you have a problem, here are the steps you will follow to do better, get smarter, make a difference. As opposed to maybe developing a plan, which could be pretty expensive potentially. So our recommendation, as I say, on that is to, on the one hand, direct the regional boards in the final order to actually proactively review their current MS4 permits and look to see whether there's a compliance pathway in those as well. And then we're actually going to be so bold as to suggest to the state board look at its own permits that it issues, in particular the Phase 2 permit, and see whether there's a compliance pathway there as well. And we're happy, obviously, to help with that review and provide some ideas.
Permit, but we haven't gone through the door we opened.
On the second issue, compliance to stormwater retention, the state board's developing strategic initiative for stormwater obviously promotes the idea of stormwater capture and use, and the 85th percentile is all about that, basically, multi-benefit projects helping deal with the drought issue. You heard today, though, from some permittees that this uncertainty is suddenly interjecting this whole possible disincentive that would act against the idea of going after 85th percentile projects. And so that's obviously not something we want to hear, even when it's raining. We've got to be pushing these kinds of projects as much as we can. So we're recommending that the language be modified to try to remove that compliance uncertainty and to basically remove that disincentive to following multi-benefit projects. We actually heard anecdotally that once some permittees saw that language, they said, well, we're not going to pursue that project because who knows where it will end. We just have no idea, and there's no benefit really that's necessarily on the table, which was actually quite disconcerting to hear that kind of reaction to the order. We also saw in the draft order that the 85th percentile couldn't be supported technically, this idea of the knee of the curve, the law of diminishing returns. And that surprised us. I think we all know that concept. We understand that concept. It helps avoid lost opportunity costs if you try and get to 95th percentile when you really shouldn't be trying to do that anymore. So we would recommend that the regional board, in this case, do the work, and we're happy to help with that to actually build the technical support for the 85th percentile standard, and then recognize that the compliance with that can constitute compliance, again, to maintain the incentives for that. And then the third issue is what we talked about here, which is, okay, you get to the 85th percentile, and you haven't solved the problem completely. You probably solved a lot of it, but it's still a potential problem. You haven't necessarily met the water quality standards. What do you do? Obviously, bacteria is one that people are talking quite a bit about. There is some precedent for the state board issuing orders to deal with this issue. We reference one here from the city of Lompoc where there was an assessment done, and the sort of the goal line was sort of modified at that point when we got to the 85th percentile. So we recommend you take a look at that and see what you could do there. But I think what we would say generally is this is what adaptive management is all about. I mean, it happens in life all the time. You have set a goal, you don't quite get there, you don't necessarily give up, but you also start to question everything at that point. You should question everything. Is the goal properly set? Is it achievable? Even if the goal is properly set 20 years before, it may be different today. I know on the TMDLs, again in the Bay Area, we went through PCBs and mercury. The goals are just amazingly high to try and reach 95% reduction in PCBs. But we only agreed to that in the Bay Area because we had a very thoughtful, methodical process to try and get there. If we had to sign on the bottom line that we would get there all the way in day one, we said, there's just no way we can do that. We couldn't possibly sign a document that said that. So the Water Board gave us 20 years and gave us a very methodical process to get there. But we also recognize that even if the TMDL target was properly set, even if the waste allocations were properly set, 20 years pass, things change. The VAE may attenuate some of those PCBs over time. They may go away. They may transform. Other things come into play. New BMPs come into play. So as a manager, when you get to that point, you should just stop and say, wait a minute, let's check every assumption and then move forward from there, as opposed to saying, no, you still got to hit that number, or you don't have to hit that number. So our recommendation basically is when you get to that point, do what a manager does typically, which is to check every assumption and then go from there in a more thoughtful, more informed way at that point, obviously, than you were before you started down that path. And then finally, I just have a summary slide here. I'm not going to take up all my time in the interest of getting us out of here, but these are your recommendations here. We'll give a lot more detail on the 21st.
Thank you very much, as always. Any questions? You're just sitting there?
Just if there are any questions.
All right, no, I think we're good. Thank you very
Actually,
much.
I will add, just real quick to follow up with Jeff on the basin plan issues and the water quality standards, and I think we've had a lot of discussions in a lot of different contexts, but to Tess Denham here for the California Association of Stormwater Quality Agencies, there is a lot of historical state board precedent that talks about that you can go back and look and change the standard. The basin plan can't open that door for you. And I see what we were really asking is that the order recognize that there may be the point that those standards do need to be reevaluated, or that the basin plan needs to be reevaluated, which is what the Lompoc order did. So that was our reference with respect to that.
Yeah, and that's going back a ways, huh? 1981?
Oh, I could take you back further if you like. Rancho Caballero, 1970-something.
She went back in the library for that one. Those concepts speak to that issue of what happens if the enhanced watershed management plan that's based on infiltration, somehow the data in the receiving waters don't show attainment of standards, and that's the big question. But it is something that's going to be a long ways out. And I would just, for food for thought, say that if you're going to go about the process of changing a water quality standard, it's no small thing, right? Tom, Greg, and Amel. And you need to have evidence with you to justify whether the standard is reasonable. Let's just look into the future 20 years and see a catchment that has succeeded in attaining 85th or even 95th percentile infiltration, and they're not attaining a standard. Don't you think that's substantive information to be brought to bear to potentially justify a modification of a standard? That you've actually built the environment to support infiltration and you're not meeting the standard. That's evidence you can bring forward at that time, 2 or 3 state water boards in the future.
Thank you. Tom, I'd like to ask, the question came up about plans, whether there needed to be concrete plans. And I just happened to be sitting next to you at lunch. And we didn't talk about this permit, but we did talk about how concrete do plans need to be. And you were expressing some contrarian views.
Concrete plans, really? That's gray infrastructure. Wait.
Green plans, all colored plans. What I was expressing was the concern with the burden of a plan-based approach in having the burden of reviewing and considering the adequacy of plans as a main means of determining compliance. So the approach that I was talking about and Jeff is referring to, in part, we laid out that approach in the Mercury and PCB's, San Francisco Bay Mercury PCB's TML implementation plan, a phased implementation scheme that was permit term based. So at the onset of each permit term, we consider updated information, any plans that have been developed and projected actions, and translate them into permit requirements that establish certainty as to what must be done during that permit term to manage cause and contribution with appropriate performance standards of sorts that would be drive tracking and, if necessary, drive enforcement. So rather than relying on a plan developed during the permit term, we consider any plans in the process of reissuing and specify within the permit what would happen during that term, and then revisit it in a recurring basis as we go through reissuance every 5 years or so.
Well, certainly to give credence to that concern, I certainly share the concern that our permitting actions would create disincentive to multi-benefit infiltration type projects, and so I think we'll be looking at that. But in this discussion, I hope that there's some comfort taken, that we're not trying to set this thing up on a permit term time scale to come unraveled based on monitoring data. That this is a long-term vision that that the cities are embarking on, and so there's not going to be off-ramps on a permit term time scale, and if our language indicates that could happen, we need to tighten it up. I think I personally read it a little differently. I think it's soft enough, but like you say, if it's creating disincentive, we should work with folks through the written comments that we receive to see if there's any suggestions on reckoning with the reality that, yes, we need to meet standards. And we've made that clear, but we know it will take time. And we recognize there's investments. And I thought ML's language in here is one of my favorites. I don't know the page, but these are significant investments that we're anticipating. They meet multiple benefits. It's not just driven by permit requirements. There's an infrastructure setting for these investments. But recognizing that they're substantial, there needs to be some assurance you know, that we'll be looking at this information carefully. Thanks.
All right, let's moving right along. For SWRCB, Susan Paulson.
Hi, Chair Marcus, members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for bringing the rain. There were a couple of things that struck me in sitting and listening, and I'm sure they struck all of you too. First, you know, there's a question about affordability and funding. Even if we know what the right things are to do, how on earth are we going to pay for it? I think there's a corollary question, which is even if we had infinite funding and we spent it, would we get to the standards? Would we be able to achieve compliance? And a few speakers before me brought up the idea of bacteria. And I agree with them that that's probably the most difficult. We know that runoff from open space, natural undeveloped areas exceeds bacteria criteria. We know we have problems in dry weather as well as wet. And we know that they aren't all human caused. So with that framework, SWRCB's focus really has been in talking with water board members in the past about green infrastructure and sustainable investments, and about regional watershed-based multipurpose projects, and still supports that. Support the State Board Stormwater Strategic Initiative process, and would like to continue to work with the State Board staff and State Board members as that process moves forward. We think, though, that it is important that the numeric limits, if you will, the objectives that are to be met at the end of all of this process, be viewed as goals, because there are problems and concerns with the objectives and with our ability to meet them, even if we didn't have the funding and the resource restrictions. So as further background, clearly we support sustainable green infrastructure approaches to stormwater control. That's been detailed in a report that we wrote, and you know, there are a handful of examples throughout that report of really good projects. Not all of them can meet the 85th percentile criteria. And we'd like to support projects that are the right things to do and the sustainable green infrastructure things to do, even where they can't meet those criteria, because they offer a whole range of benefits. And I don't need to go through this. You know this. They're easier to fund. They promote partnerships. They achieve all sorts of corollary benefits. They're lower energy, fewer chemicals, less waste, less maintenance, all of those things. The draft order appears to support sustainable green infrastructure approaches, at least in concept. There's language in there that's very helpful along those lines. We know that EPA's policy currently is to support sustainability and sustainable infrastructure investments for water and for wastewater, and in our opinion, stormwater is a resource, just like these other kinds of water, if you will. And the alternative, frankly, is probably a hardscaped, energy-intensive treatment control. The picture on the left is one that I took while...
Thank you. That hasn't been brought up yet. I've been wondering why it hasn't. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, I think the concern here is that if we're forced to meet very stringent numeric limits under all conditions all the time, even if it's at some point in the future, we're going to end up with hardscape gray infrastructure controls. The picture on the left is near my house. I believe it's an Austin sand filter adjacent to the 210 freeway. It's been under construction for well over a year. The photo on the right, I'm sure the Orange County folks here could tell you more about it, but it was almost a packaged treatment control to handle bacteria in dry weather urban runoff. And the facility was very successful in reducing bacteria concentrations, but once that water was put back in the stream, the bacteria concentrations quickly rose again, even in dry weather conditions, to above water quality standards. So what does cause or contribute mean in that context? The draft order appears to recognize the difficulty in meeting numeric limitations under all circumstances. There's been prior discussion about this finding, that the stormwater retention approach is promising, but we don't have findings in the record to support the idea that this approach will lead to attainment in all cases. And it's hard to see this, but the Blue Ribbon report from 2006 also says essentially the same thing. Just to quote just the bottom in the interest of time, even for conventional pollutants, meaning things like TSS, there presently is no protocol that enables an engineer to design with certainty a BMP that will produce a desired outflow concentration for a constituent of concern. In other words, we're not sure that the BMPs, the regional treatment kind of approaches, can get us to the end goal all the time. We know that they can and do make very significant improvements in water quality, and we know that they're a necessary part of an integrated green infrastructure approach. but they probably can't get us to full attainment under all conditions for the biggest of storms and everywhere all of the time. So for that reason, we would respectfully request that the State Board consider using the numeric requirements as goals, not as strictly enforceable legal requirements, because we fear that enforcing them, even in the distant future, as strictly enforceable legal requirements will lead to hardscape solutions and undesirable results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Perfect. Now, before we go into public comment, I suggest we take a 10-minute break so people can refresh, hydrate, whatever you need to do. We'll start with Sharam Carrigan, City of LA.
Because I'm worried about hydration.